Hey guys, tonight we are going to explore a great legend together, a person whose story is often overshadowed by the enormous legacy of her namesake descendant. I'm sure that every one of us knows Queen Elizabeth II, the monarch who reigned over England for 7 decades, becoming an icon of the age. But if Elizabeth II was the one who kept the royal flame from extinguishing, then Elizabeth I was the one who ignited that flame. So, just how extraordinary was this first queen? She was an absolutely powerful woman, one who survived a death sentence, challenged the largest war fleet in the world, and turned her single status into the most powerful political weapon. What's astonishing is that she did all of this despite the fact that she was never meant to sit on the throne in the first place. That is why, throughout history, many assert that Queen Elizabeth I is the most badass and powerful monarch England has ever had. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And by the way, don't forget to comment below to let me know where you are and what the local time is where you are. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Many people today know Queen Elizabeth II, who reigned for 70 years as of 2022. But few are aware of Elizabeth I, a monarch whose ascension was never assured, yet whose reign became one of the most remarkable in English history. Born into the tumultuous Tudor dynasty, Elizabeth grew up amidst rivalries, betrayals, and shifting allegiances that would shape her character long before she ever claimed the crown. Her father's 6 marriages and the violent fates of her half-siblings cast a long shadow over her childhood, but they also forged in her a steadfast resolve and an unyielding sense of duty. By the time Elizabeth was in her mid-20s, England faced an existential threat unlike any it had seen since the Norman conquest of 1066. In 1588, the Spanish Armada, 130 of the most formidable warships afloat, sailed toward English shores with the intention of invasion. The Spanish fleet, backed by the wealth and prestige of Philip II's empire, was widely feared across Europe. Its purpose was twofold: to overthrow Protestant England and restore Catholic rule, and to demonstrate Spain's naval supremacy once and for all. As news of the Armada's approach spread, many expected the Queen to remain cloistered in the safety of her royal residence, directing her generals by dispatches and envoys. Instead, Elizabeth chose to stand shoulder to shoulder with her commanders. In a soft, measured voice that belied the gravity of the moment, she declared her intention to meet the threat head-on. She travelled to Tilbury, a coastal town fortified against the Spanish advance, not as a distant sovereign, but as a leader among her people. On the day she arrived, the mists curled around the ramparts, and the sea breeze carried the scent of salt and anticipation. The Royal Navy lay anchored nearby, its sails furled, its guns primed. The soldiers and sailors, wrapped in heavy cloaks against the chill, steadied themselves for what might come. Elizabeth, wearing a simple gown of pale silk and bearing no visible symbols of regal trappings, stepped onto the platform erected before the assembled troops. Her presence was at once regal and reassuring, like the gentle glow of a lantern in a dark night. She began her speech in a tone so calm it almost lulled the onlookers into a hush. Yet every word carried weight. Every pause was pregnant with meaning. "I am come amongst you," she said, "not to seek recreation or amusement, but being resolved, in the midst and heat of battle, to live and die amongst you all, to lay down for my God, for my kingdom, and for my people, my honour, and my blood, even in the dust." The gathered men listened, some closing their eyes as if committing each syllable to memory. She went on, in words that would echo through the centuries. "Know ye that I have the body but of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too." There was a hush, and then a swell of cheers that rolled across the battlements like wind-ruffled waves. The Queen's speech, delivered in that soft, almost sleepy cadence, infused her soldiers with newfound courage. It was as stirring as any cinematic utterance, perhaps even more affecting than the grand speeches of popular drama. Yet it retained a simplicity and sincerity that rendered it unforgettable. That very night, the English navy put to sea. The smaller, more maneuverable English vessels harassed the Spanish line, firing broadsides and retreating into the haze before the invading fleet could bring its full might to bear. In the days that followed, storms battered the Armada. scattering its ships and forcing its commanders into disarray. When the survivors limped back to Spain's coasts, the myth of Spanish naval invincibility lay shattered upon the waves. Elizabeth's actions at Tilbury did more than repel a foreign threat. They announced the emergence of a new kind of monarch, one who would learn from adversity, who would stand with her people in their darkest hours, and who would wield her authority with both compassion and strength. In that moment, she transcended the fragile expectations placed upon her gender and station, embodying the spirit of England itself, resilient, courageous, and determined. It was the first of many defining acts that would establish Elizabeth I, not merely as a queen of lineage, but as a queen of legend. Before Elizabeth ever marshalled the English fleet against the Armada, she endured 2 long months, confined within the grey stone walls of the Tower of London at the tender age of 21. In March of 1554, after the Duke of Northumberland's failed rebellion against Queen Mary I, Elizabeth, her half-sister's sister by blood, but her rival by faith, was deemed a dangerous symbol of Protestant dissent. Mary, a devout Catholic determined to restore her faith's dominance, viewed her Protestant sibling as a threat to the throne. Thus Elizabeth found herself thrust into the same chambers where her mother, Anne Boleyn, had languished before her execution 2 years earlier. The tower's damp corridors echoed with the whispers of past tragedies. Stone floors, worn smooth by the boots of soldiers and the sandals of prisoners, offered no comfort. Elizabeth's cell was austere, a narrow cot, a small barred window high above, and a single chamber pot. Guards made their rounds by torchlight, their footsteps muffled by the chill, and the occasional distant clank of iron bars falling into place reminded her that each breath she drew came at the mercy of another's hand. Night after night she lay awake, listening to the winds sigh through arrow slits, recalling her mother's terrified pleas and the finality of the scaffold. Each dawn brought the same questions. Would she, like her mother, face the block? Would her blood mingle with the rain that fell through the narrow window? Thoughts of the past tugged at her father's cruel suspicions, her own precarious position in a court where alliances shifted like sand. Though her heart was young, her mind had already been tempered by loss. Even so, the knowledge that death might come on Mary's orders weighed heavily upon her chest, making each breath a labour. Then came May 19, 1554, the very anniversary of her mother's execution. On that day, Elizabeth was summoned from her cell and told she would be moved to house arrest. Her relief was muted by sorrow. The very date that marked Anne Boleyn's martyrdom now witnessed her daughter's reprieve. It was a cruel symmetry, the price of her survival paid in memories of her mother's final hours. As she rode away from the tower, her carriage rattling over cobblestones, Elizabeth leaned back against the cushions, eyes closed, allowing herself a moment of fragile hope. Under house arrest, she was allowed familiar comforts, a proper bed, access to reading materials, and the company of trusted attendants. Yet the invisible bars of suspicion remained. She learned to smile through masks of politeness when courtiers visited, to laugh softly when Mary I held court stately and cold. In those months, Elizabeth observed her half-sister's reign from a distance, noting Mary's fierce loyalty to Catholic rites and her ruthless purge of dissenters, over 200 burned at the stake. Each pyre a grim reminder of faith enforced by fire. When Mary I died in November of 1558, the Tudor line seemed to purge itself of every rival. Edward VI, Mary's younger half-brother, had died years before at the age of 15, his frail body succumbing to some lingering disease. Lady Jane Grey, the 9-day queen, had briefly occupied the throne at Edward's behest, only to be executed for treason when Mary reclaimed power. Now Mary herself lay dead of an unnamed illness, her fervent Catholic mission undone by the indiscriminate reach of disease. One by one, those in line blood relatives and pawned pawns of politics had fallen away. On the 17th of November, 1558, with autumn's chill in the air and the last leaves drifting from bare branches, Elizabeth was summoned to Whitehall Palace. She entered the throne room in a gown of subdued elegance, the pearls at her neckline shimmering faintly in candlelight. At 25, she had outlived agony and despair, intrigue and betrayal, emerging with a tempered spirit and a keen understanding of power's fragility. As she ascended the steps to the throne, the assembled courtiers fell silent. The weight of history pressed down. The executions, the rebellions, the religious convulsions. Elizabeth took her seat, set her shoulders with quiet determination, and gazed across the hall. In that moment, the burdens of her past 2 months of fearful confinement, the memory of her mother's blood, became the foundation of her reign. Her crown, though heavy with jewels, felt lighter upon her brow. Thus began a new era of stability and prosperity for England. The young queen, forged in the fire of adversity, now wore her trials like armor. Her accession marked the end of discord and the dawn of a golden age, one that would see her rule for nearly half a century. Though her heart would always carry the echoes of the Tower, Elizabeth I emerged not as a victim of fate, but as a sovereign, shaped by suffering and ready to guide her kingdom with steady hands. Upon ascending the throne, Elizabeth I moved gently to soothe the religious turmoil that had convulsed England under Mary I and Edward VI. Though herself a loyal adherent of the Protestant faith, she extended a cautious welcome to her Catholic subjects, granting them the freedom to worship in private as long as they acknowledged her as the one true sovereign. In so doing, she wove a fragile peace into the very fabric of her realm, encouraging men and women of both confessions to lay down their doctrinal swords and attend instead to the duties of civic life. It was a quiet revolution, carried out not with marching armies but with words of tolerance whispered in council chambers and inscribed into new statutes. Under this policy of moderation, the arts in England ignited into a brilliant bloom. The courtyards and halls of palaces echoed with the voices of playwrights and poets for the first time in generations. Drama flourished without fear of censorship from either ecclesiastical or secular authorities. Tragedies took to the stage, weaving tales of human frailty and heroic resolve, while comedies spun gentle jests at courtly manners. Sonneteers composed verses that caught the music of the English tongue in lilting lines, and court masks dazzled audiences with their elaborate costumes, masks, and dance. Patronage from the Queen herself, who delighted in inviting emerging talents to perform before her, provided both encouragement and legitimacy. Thus did the arts come to stand at the heart of Elizabeth's golden reign, imbuing the age with a cultural legacy that would outlive its monarch. Elizabeth's own education set the tone for this intellectual renaissance. From her earliest years, she was schooled in the classics, mastering the rhetoric of Cicero and the histories of Livy in their original Latin. Before she could truly call herself a young woman, she had gone on to learn French, Greek, Spanish, Italian, and Welsh, so that by the time she reached her mid-20s, she spoke 7 languages fluently. In her private chambers, surrounded by leather-bound volumes and rich tapestries, she would peruse foreign treatises on philosophy and statecraft, turning each page with slow deliberation. Her renowned erudition granted her an authority in diplomatic audiences, where foreign ambassadors found themselves conversing with a queen as well versed in their tongues as in matters of protocol. Yet Elizabeth's talents were not confined to the study. She was equally known for her prowess with bow and arrow, a habit she maintained on crisp autumn mornings in the palace grounds. On horseback, she moved with effortless grace, her steeds' hooves sending up puffs of late summer dust as they raced across open fields. Courtiers often found her there at dawn, draped in a simple riding habit, hair bound back, eyes bright with the thrill of the chase. Such scenes endeared her to the common people. Here was a sovereign who could match them in sport and skill, a queen who needed no escort to cross the plains. Inside the palace walls, the court became synonymous with lavish entertainment. Candlelit banquets stretched into the small hours, tables groaning under platters of roasted game, sweetmeats, and exotic fruits brought in from distant lands. Lutes and viols filled the night air with gentle melodies, and dancers moved fluidly across polished stone floors, their silk garments catching the flicker of torches. In these moments, Elizabeth was both host and participant, sometimes joining the dance in slippered feet, sometimes rising to propose a toast in a soft, sonorous voice that carried through the hall. It was a court of pleasure and refinement, yet never frivolous, for beneath the gaiety lay the steady heartbeat of politics, alliances forged over shared laughter, loyalties sealed in the swirl of a minuet. Through her combination of scholarly depth, cultural openness, and martial vigor, Elizabeth carved out an image that resonated with every stratum of society. To the nobility, she was the embodiment of regal dignity and cultivated taste. To the merchants and artisans, She was a patron of the new intellectual order. To the soldiers and sailors, she was a commander in her own right. In villages and towns, tales spread of the wise queen who spoke to envoys in 6 tongues, who hunted deer at dawn and hosted grand feasts by night. Such stories, whispered from hearth to hearth, solidified her reputation as a monarch both formidable and benevolent, a sovereign immune to the stiff rigidity of former reigns, yet firm where firmness was required. Thus did Elizabeth I steer England into its epoch of unprecedented artistic and literary triumph. Her reign became known not merely for surviving religious strife or repelling foreign fleets, but for nurturing the human spirit in all its facets. The flowering of drama, poetry, music, and learning under her auspices cast a warm glow across the kingdom, illuminating the minds and hearts of men and women for generations to come. In this fusion of intellect, culture, and courage, Elizabeth revealed the true measure of her greatness. A ruler who shaped the destiny of a nation by embracing its creative pulse as fully as its need for security, guiding England softly yet resolutely into the luminous Golden Age. Unlike her predecessors, Elizabeth I resolved to remain single for life, a choice as calculated as any of her diplomatic maneuvers. In a Europe shaped by dynastic marriages, where alliances were sealed by the joining of crowns, she simply allowed the prospect of matrimony to hang unanswered. Princes from Sweden, archdukes from Austria, and even distant counts once whispered of wedding bells in St. James's Palace, each hoping that a union with the English Queen would elevate their own courts. Yet Elizabeth, ever mindful of the precarious balance of power, kept her intentions shrouded. She knew that to wed could invite foreign influence into her council, or worse, tempt ambitious husbands to claim authority once reserved for her alone. The most enduring of these courtships was with Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester. They had grown up together at court, inseparable in childhood and confidants in uncertainty. Dudley's devotion to Elizabeth was evident to all. He courted her with lavish gifts, from gilded caskets studded with pearls to sonnets composed in her honour. But when he knelt, offering his hand and heart, she met him with the same resolute calm that had seen her through the Tower and beyond. "I will have but one mistress here," she reportedly told him, "and no master. I would rather be a beggar and single than queen and married." And so Dudley's ardent hopes remained unfulfilled, a testament to her unwavering commitment to sovereignty over partnership. When Dudley passed away, an event that sent ripples of genuine sorrow through the court, Elizabeth's attentions turned subtly to a younger suitor, Robert Devereux, the second Earl of Essex. He was 33 years her junior, yet grew under her wing with a blend of admiration and ambition. His quick wit and handsome countenance caught her eye, and he rose rapidly through the ranks, earning commands and honours that bespoke the Queen's favour. Their relationship, though never formalised in marriage, became the subject of eager gossip from Whitehall to Windsor. At court banquets, guests would witness shared glances, subtle touches of the hand, and private laughter, as though they inhabited a secret world apart from royal protocol. Yet Devereux's temperament, so fiery in youth, proved ill-suited to the patient art of statecraft that Elizabeth prized. Impetuous and vain, he chafed under her careful guidance, growing frustrated when she withheld the reins of power he assumed would be his by closeness. In time, his discontent boiled over into conspiracy. He gathered a small cohort of disaffected nobles and plotted what became known as the Essex Rebellion, a brief, ill-conceived attempt to seize control of the court's machinery. On the day the uprising collapsed, Essex was arrested and tried for treason. News of his downfall reached Elizabeth while she sat at her virginals, the gentle notes of the instrument filling a hushed chamber. She paused, fingers hovering above the keys, and allowed the silence to linger for a moment that felt suspended in time. Then, with a quiet resolve, she resumed her playing, as though the world beyond the music were of no consequence. Essex was executed, his head taken from his shoulders in a grim public spectacle. The choice to spare his life until the last breath was hers alone. Yet in the end, justice or perhaps necessity demanded his death. Still, the memory of his courtship and their shared affection lingered, woven into the tapestry of Elizabeth's reign. She emerged more circumspect, more firmly convinced that marriage represented a gamble too perilous for an English crown already beset by religious strife and international rivalry. By refusing to marry, Elizabeth demonstrated what modern observers might term soft power, the ability to influence events through personal example and strategic ambiguity rather than blunt force. She cultivated an image of the Virgin Queen, a title she used judiciously in her communications, implying purity of purpose and singular devotion to her realm. Yet behind the facade of chastity lay a woman acutely aware of her own magnetism, deploying flirtations and courtly favors to secure alliances without ceding authority. Her unmarried state became a diplomatic tool. Potential husbands courted her with the promise of alliance, their attentions a lever she could apply or release at will. In an age when rulers were expected to pass dynastic continuity to heirs, Elizabeth's choice was revolutionary. She turned the absence of marriage into a statement of self-rule, rewriting expectations for monarchs in a patriarchal society. Her courtiers learned that to earn her trust was more valuable than any title bestowed through marriage. Foreign diplomats discovered that courting Elizabeth required patience, tact, and respect for her unyielding autonomy. England, under her watchful eye, stood as proof that a kingdom could prosper under a sovereign whose first loyalty was to her people and realm rather than to a spouse. Thus did Elizabeth I wield her unmarried status not as a weakness but as a source of strength. In every unanswered marriage proposal lay a subtle assertion of independence. In every diplomatic overture left unresolved, the power of possibility. And in her steadfast refusal to trade her crown for a consort, she affirmed that her highest union was with the nation itself, an eternal partnership that no wedding ceremony could ever surpass. Under Elizabeth I, England embarked upon an age of exploration that would lay the groundwork for a global empire in centuries to come. The longing for exotic spices, precious metals, and national prestige had taken hold among her subjects, and the Queen, ever attuned to the aspirations of her people, quietly sanctioned ventures that blurred the line between commerce and audacity. Rather than dispatch royal fleets under openly declared commissions, she turned to private enterprise, granting letters of marque to daring captains who would prey upon the vessels of rival powers. In particular, she entrusted Sir Francis Drake with missions that would both enrich the crown and humiliate England's great adversary, Spain. In 1577, Drake set sail with a small flotilla of ships, their hulls sleek and nimble compared to the lumbering galleons of the Spanish Armada. The letters of marque he carried authorized him to seize Spanish vessels laden with gold and silver from the New World. This arrangement transformed him into what contemporaries called a privateer, neither pirate nor admiral, but something in between adventurers who answered to the Queen even as they plundered the spoils of her enemies. With royal backing whispered but never proclaimed, Drake raided coastal settlements and intercepted treasure fleets with bold efficiency. His crew, hardened by storm and skirmish, learned to move swiftly, striking where the Spanish least expected, then melting away into the mists of dawn. When Drake completed his famed circumnavigation of the globe between 1577 and 1580, he became only the second man in recorded history to do so. News of his triumph rippled through English ports, carried by mariners and merchants eager for a share of the newfound wealth. Elizabeth, seated in her private gallery, received dispatches of Drake's journey with a knowing smile. Although she never publicly boasted of his successes, she quietly ensured that the proceeds of his ventures filled the royal coffers and funded further voyages. By undermining Spanish claims in the Caribbean and the Pacific, she chipped away at her rival's maritime dominance without declaring open war. Meanwhile, the Queen encouraged other explorers to follow Drake's example. She granted Sir Walter Raleigh the right to establish English settlements along the eastern coast of North America. Raleigh's ventures, beginning in 1584, aimed to discover not only gold but also the fabled elixir that would cure scurvy and other ailments. Though his first colony at Roanoke would ultimately vanish into legend, his efforts ignited English interest in colonization. Men and women of various trades, farmers, craftsmen, soldiers, sought royal patents to claim land in the New World, believing that they would reap fortunes greater than those promised by the silver-laden ships of Spain. Elizabeth's diplomatic finesse complemented her maritime strategy. While foreign courts speculated on whether she might marry a Swedish prince or an Austrian archduke, she used those very negotiations to garner intelligence and secure temporary alliances. Royal envoys carried news of brewing storms in the Caribbean and the shifting loyalties of Spanish viceroys, enabling English privateers to anticipate the enemy's movements. At the same time, Elizabeth's refusal to settle any marriage left her suitors dangling, eager for favour, yet never certain of her intentions. This perpetual state of courtship served to distract rival monarchs and to maintain a veneer of peace at home, while England's private fleets roamed the seas. Back in London, the merchants who financed these expeditions formed joint stock companies to spread the risk of exploration. Small investors pooled their savings to outfit ships bound for distant shores, hoping to return with cargoes of tobacco, sugar, or pearls. Elizabeth, observing this budding commercial revolution, granted charters that conferred legal protections and exclusive trading rights. In this way, the seeds of the East India Company and similar ventures were sown ventures that would one day bring spices, silks, and tea from Asia and turn England into a global trading nexus. By weaving together privateering, colonization, and financial innovation, Elizabeth I laid the foundations of what would become the British Empire. She did so not with triumphant proclamations or grandiose declarations, but through calculated encouragement and subtle patronage. Small, fast ships replaced slow galleons as the tools of choice. Covert letters of marque replaced formal declarations of war, and the promise of personal gain inspired individuals to risk life and limb on the ocean's vast highways. The result was a steady flow of wealth, knowledge, and influence back to England, enough to elevate it from a distracted island kingdom to a maritime power whose reach would span the globe for centuries. In that gentle, almost sleepy unfolding of events, Elizabeth's vision bore fruit, guiding England along a course of discovery and dominion that reshaped the world. Upon securing her virtue in matrimony, Elizabeth I wove what might be called a marriage game into the very fabric of her foreign policy. She did not summon grand bridesmaids or dispatch grand processions of gold-trimmed carriages. Rather, she left the prospect of union tantalizingly open, neither rejecting nor accepting the numerous offers laid at her feet. From the frozen courts of Sweden to the stately palaces of Austria, envoys arrived bearing portraits, exotic gifts, and carefully composed proposals. Each delegation travelled with an air of solemn ceremony, convinced that a match with the English Queen would elevate their own house and guarantee England's friendship. Yet Elizabeth, sitting in her satin-lined cabinet at Whitehall, would peruse each missive in a languid fashion, her eyelids heavy, her voice soft as she instructed her secretaries to file this, or keep them waiting. This perpetual state of courtship served multiple ends. First, it flattered foreign powers, making each suitor believe he alone held the key to a favoured alliance. Second, it allowed Elizabeth to extract intelligence. While she feigned indecision, her ambassadors abroad reported back any shifts in European politics. A sudden alliance between France and the papacy, rumours of war stirring in the Low Countries, or the ascendancy of a young prince in Denmark. Such tidbits proved more valuable than any dowry. By the time any suitor pressed for a definitive answer, Elizabeth had already gleaned his true motives and calculated how best to use them. No relationship exemplified this strategy more poignantly than her bond with Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester. From their earliest days as children in the royal nursery, they had been inseparable. In the tumultuous years of Mary I's reign, when Elizabeth was confined first to Hatfield and then quietly watched at court, Dudley's presence was her chief comfort and confidant. When he sought her hand despite having divorced twice, he presented jewels of rare cut and letters of ardent devotion. Yet Elizabeth, in her thoughtfully measured tones, replied once, and only once, "I will exercise sovereignty here alone, not in subjection to another." Her refusal stung him deeply, but it also reinforced the lesson that the Queen's singular loyalty was to her crown and her realm. When the Earl's life came to its natural close, Elizabeth's attentions drifted to a far younger man, Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex, her gallant protégé, and a man 33 years her junior. In Essex's bright eyes, she saw echoes of Dudley's earnest devotion, and in his eager steps, she detected the same ambition that had carried him swiftly through the ranks of court favour. The court buzzed with gossip at their closeness, whispered promises beneath moonlit balconies, hurried meetings in the Privy Garden, and hesitant touches that suggested hope beyond mere alliance. Yet no ring exchanged hands. Essex's impetuous spirit, so celebrated in youthful triumphs, grew restless under the Queen's careful restraint. Confident of her affection and impatient for command, he came to believe himself indispensable to the state. His frustration swelled until, in a fevered moment of disloyalty, he attempted what became known as the Essex Rebellion. A small cadre of conspirators gathered in his house, their whispered plans betraying desperation rather than strategy. They would seize strategic posts, present a fait accompli, and force the Queen's ministers to reckon with their authority. When the plot unravelled within hours, Elizabeth's response was swift. She ordered Essex's arrest and summoned him to trial. Her court chamber hushed as lawyers recited charges of treason. The hapless Earl stood before her, once her beloved protégé, now a condemned traitor. As he was led to execution, his fate sealed by his own ambition, Elizabeth sat at her virginals in a nearby chamber, her fingers poised just above the ivory keys. Messengers delivered the grim news in hushed tones the rebels quelled. Essex's guilt beyond question. For a heartbeat she paused. Then, as though to reclaim the peaceful silence, she resumed her playing. The gentle notes drifted through the corridors, as sleepy and unhurried as a lullaby, concealing the tumult of her resolve. This unflinching action underscored two truths. First, that Elizabeth would not allow personal affection to override her duty, and second, that she possessed a mastery of statecraft so complete that even the execution of a favoured courtier did not ruffle her composure. By placing the welfare of the nation above any private sentiment, she sent a clear message to her subjects and to wily diplomats abroad that her power was absolute, unyielding to emotion or intrigue. Elizabeth's so-called Virgin Queen persona thus became an emblem of soft power. She harnessed the allure of potential marriage without ceding an inch of authority. She met every ambassador with courteous ambiguity, a gentle smile that promised nothing, a phrase so soothing it might drift into oblivion, and an unspoken lesson that England's prosperity would not be predicated on dynastic unions. Instead, it would rest on her own steady stewardship. In the annals of royal history, no queen before had so deftly combined personal magnetism with political calculation. Elizabeth's refusal to marry transformed potential vulnerability into a diplomatic advantage. The mere possibility of marriage ensured that foreign courts treated England's interests with deference, while the certainty of her single status preserved her autonomy. Thus did she administer her realm with unparalleled skill, demonstrating that true power could reside as much in restraint as in conquest. And as the candles guttered in her private chambers, the soft strains of her virginals whispered a lesson that she alone could embody. The greatest sovereignty is that which lies unencumbered by another's claim. While the courts of Europe remained entangled in dynastic intrigues and political marriages, Elizabeth I turned her gaze toward the vast horizons of the sea. She recognized that true power would come not from choked canals or shifting alliances on the continent, but from mastery of the oceans themselves. Thus she embarked on a deliberate campaign to bolster England's naval strength, enlisting both royal ships and privately outfitted vessels known as privateers to harry the treasures of her Spanish adversaries under the cloak of national authority. In 1572, Elizabeth quietly authorized Sir Francis Drake, already famed for his daring exploits, to strike at Spanish shipping in the Caribbean. Under the cover of dark nights and shifting fog, Drake's squadron intercepted richly laden galleons, their hulls heavy with gold and silver plundered from the New World. The spoils were shipped back to Plymouth and distributed as prize money, filling English coffers and stoking the public's appetite for further adventure. Though technically piracy by Spanish lights, to Elizabeth's subjects Drake's raids were acts of patriotic valor, an assertion that England would no longer bow to Spain's maritime supremacy. Encouraged by these successes, in 1577 the Queen entrusted Drake with an even more audacious venture to circumnavigate the globe. His mission, however, was not that of a peaceful mariner charting new lands, but of a hunter preying upon enemy wealth wherever it might lie. For 3 years until 1580 Drake's ship, the Golden Hind, and its consorts ranged from the chill coasts of Patagonia to the Spice Islands of the East, capturing Spanish galleons at every turn. When at last Drake returned, the English monarch refrained from public fanfare. Instead, she saw to it that his men received pensions and lands, quietly rewarding loyalties earned on the high seas. His voyage sent ripples through Europe, shattering myths of Spanish invulnerability and marking England as an emergent naval power. Elizabeth also saw promise in establishing permanent footholds overseas. She granted Sir Walter Raleigh a patent to explore and colonize lands to the west. In 1584, Raleigh sponsored the lost colony of Roanoke, Virginia, on the shores of what would later become North Carolina. Though that first attempt vanished into legend, the enterprise sparked feverish interest in colonization. Merchants and gentry formed companies to fund voyages, driven by hopes of discovering gold, silver, or that elusive elixir to combat scurvy and other maladies. Under Elizabeth's watchful eye, these ventures laid the conceptual groundwork for England's future settlements, sowing seeds of tobacco, sugar, and other cash crops that would one day transform the economy of her realm. To support these far-flung adventures, Elizabeth fostered advances in ship design and navigation. She encouraged the construction of so-called ship-lightning vessels, sleek galleons armed with broadside guns, yet nimble enough to outmaneuver Spain's larger, lumbering ships. These faster hulls could deliver a devastating volley of cannon fire before tacking away into the safety of open water. At the docks of Deptford and Woolwich, shipwrights experimented with hull shapes and rigging that balanced speed, cargo capacity, and firepower. Meanwhile, mathematicians and mapmakers at Greenwich worked to refine navigational instruments, astrolabes, cross-staffs, and the nascent backstaff, ensuring that English captains could fix their position even under stormy skies. This two-pronged strategy of raiding and exploration achieved remarkable results. England's maritime defenders grew in confidence as Spanish threats receded, and the influx of treasure eased the crown's finances. Merchants, too, prospered. They outfitted ships with private capital, knowing that even a single successful voyage could yield returns many times the initial investment. Tales of Queen Elizabeth's pirates spread like wildfire. Songs, ballads, and pamphlets celebrated their daring exploits, fueling the popular imagination and attracting eager recruits to the merchant and naval ranks. As the decade closed, Elizabeth's naval network had become the envy of Europe. The fleets she had fostered, some flying the royal ensign, others the broad pennant of privateers, projected English influence to every sea lane. The knowledge gained from these voyages enriched navigational charts and natural histories, bringing new maps, exotic spices, and unfamiliar flora and fauna to London's bustling markets. Back home, dockyards thrummed with activity, and towns along the southern coast swelled with sailors and craftsmen whose livelihoods now depended on the deep-water trade. Above all, Elizabeth's maritime vision laid the foundations for what would become the British Empire. By daring to pit swift, well-armed ships against the armadas of Spain, by nurturing colonists' ambitions to claim distant shores, and by advancing the art of shipbuilding and navigation, she steered England onto a course of global prominence. Though she rarely set foot on a vessel herself, her influence sailed upon every breeze and was carried across every wave. In the sleepy hush of candle-lit council rooms, Elizabeth made decisions that resonated on every ocean, linking her name forever with an age of exploration and laying the launching pad for centuries of English dominance on the seas. Upon settling the tempest of foreign threats and dynastic strife, Elizabeth I turned her attention inward, determined to nourish the spirit of her realm as much as its defences. With a soft but unwavering hand, she set about cultivating what would come to be called a literary court, inviting poets, playwrights, and scholars from every corner of England to gather beneath her roof. It was a gentle revolution of the mind. Where once sermons and proclamations had dominated public discourse, now verses and dramas took centre stage. Each season, the Queen's private theatre at Whitehall became the site of marvellous performances. Lanterns flickered in the rafters, casting dancing shadows on velvet curtains, while benches filled with eager courtiers and invited guests. Among those who answered her summons was William Shakespeare, a young playwright whose pen bore the weight of deep emotion and keen observation. Under Elizabeth's patronage, he brought forth timeless tales, such as Romeo and Juliet, and Hamlet stories of love and betrayal, of kings and paupers, that resonated far beyond the walls of court. Nearby, Edmund Spenser composed The Fairy Queen, weaving allegory and epic grandeur into pages that celebrated virtue and heroism. These works, birthed in the hush of candlelight, would echo through centuries as pillars of world literature. But Elizabeth did not content herself with mere sponsorship. Every so often she would slip into the audience in simple attire, as though wishful to lose herself among the throng. At other times, she would ascend the stage, her voice carrying the lines of a chorus, lending her presence to the very art she so cherished. Such moments became the stuff of legend, a sovereign who, despite her station, joined in the creation of beauty, as though the boundaries between monarch and artist could blur beneath the intensity of shared inspiration. Beyond the theatre, Whitehall's grand halls thrummed with weekly festivities. Torches glowed in sconce-hung niches, and tables groaned under decanters of spiced wine, platters of candied fruits, and sweetmeats glazed in honey. Musicians, lutanists, viol players, and harpists mingled their melodies in a soft, enveloping tide, guiding dancers through intricate steps. Elizabeth, adorned in gowns studded with pearls and gemstones that caught the lamplight, sat enthroned atop an ornate dais, her eyes bright with pleasure as she surveyed the twirling figures below. When the music paused, she would rise to present a royal fanfare, her hand raised in graceful salute, then blend back into the rhythm of the evening. All the while, her own education stood as a testament to the power of the intellect. From her earliest days, Elizabeth had been schooled in history, philosophy, and the art of rhetoric. By the age of 19, she was conversant in 7 languages: English, Latin, French, Greek, Spanish, Italian, and Welsh, each acquired through hours bent over dusty tomes and guided by tutors whose names are lost to time. When she penned letters to foreign princes or engaged in debates with envoys, she did so in the elegant flow of Latin or the polished eloquence of classical Greek. Her words, precise and measured, could praise a new alliance one moment and critique a policy misstep the next, all without betraying fatigue. Such erudition lent England a new prestige among the courts of Europe. Ambassadors who travelled from Paris, Madrid, or Vienna found themselves not before a distant figurehead, but before a monarch whose sharp intellect mirrored their own. They presented gifts of jewels and fine cloth, but often left with tokens of admiration for the Queen's learning. A volume of Latin poetry passed between hands, or a shared discourse on the latest treatise in natural philosophy. In those encounters, Elizabeth's dual roles as sovereign and scholar melded into a singular presence that commanded respect and fostered genuine esteem. Thus, under her guidance, England's might was no longer measured solely in cannons or fleets, but in the prosperity of the mind and the flourishing of the arts. Theatres sprouted in towns far from London, inspired by the Queen's example. Printing presses churned out plays and poems in volumes that travelled as far as the Scottish Highlands and the Low Countries. Poetry became a language of diplomacy, drama a mirror to society, and scholarship the quiet foundation upon which policy and culture alike could stand. In these endeavours, Elizabeth I demonstrated a simple yet profound truth, that a nation's strength lies equally in the steel of its swords and in the richness of its imagination. By nurturing a literary court, by joining in performances with genuine delight, and by wielding her own formidable learning as both weapon and balm, she guided England into an age of unparalleled cultural achievement. It was a legacy that would endure long after her reign, a testament to the subtle power of art and intellect when held in a queen's gentle but determined hand. As Elizabeth I entered the later years of her long reign, she turned an ever-watchful eye to the foundations of governance at home, determined that her kingdom's prosperity would rest on sound laws and effective administration. In a series of carefully measured steps, she encouraged Parliament to pass statutes that codified the responsibilities of local magistrates and justices of the peace, ensuring that royal authority would be exercised uniformly across shires and boroughs. These acts clarified the duties of sheriffs and constables, spelled out procedures for holding courts, and set penalties for neglect of office. In doing so, she wove a web of legal consistency that reached even the remotest parish, binding subjects to a single standard of order, rather than leaving them at the mercy of erratic local customs. To reinforce the Crown's fiscal health, Elizabeth overhauled the system of taxation and customs. She empowered the Royal Exchequer with new oversight powers, directing that accounts be kept with meticulous care and subject to routine audits. Complex duties on imported goods, wool, wine, and luxury items were simplified into clearly defined tariffs, reducing opportunities for underreporting and bribery. At the docks of London, Bristol, and Plymouth, customs officers now recorded each cargo in duplicate ledgers, one copy sent to Whitehall and the other retained in local archives. This redundancy, though seemingly tedious, proved a formidable deterrent against malfeasance, as discrepancies could no longer be concealed in a single book. Yet wherever there is authority, there too lies potential for corruption, and Elizabeth would not tolerate graft among her servants. She established a special body known as the Office of the Crown's Commissioners for Public Inquiry, a panel of esteemed jurists and veterans charged with investigating suspected abuses of office. When rumours reached her of embezzled funds or judges taking bribes, she dispatched these commissioners with letters of appointment bearing her own seal. Their inquiries ranged from surveying the conduct of tax collectors in the north to examining the sales of confiscated lands in the west. Reports, delivered in somnolent detail beneath candlelight, provided the Queen with the evidence she needed to remove unworthy officials and to restore seized assets to the Treasury. On the diplomatic front, Elizabeth maintained a delicate balance of power among the great states of Europe. While her secret marriage negotiations had lulled potential rivals into a state of hopeful expectation, she simultaneously offered discreet aid to the Dutch rebels fighting for their independence from Spain. In granting letters of safe conduct to Protestant envoys, she signalled that England would shield her co-religionists, provided they accepted her as their sovereign. In return, ambassadors from the Low Countries brought news of Spanish troop movements and whispered of Philip II's plans, granting England a strategic edge without provoking open war. This subtle policy of selective patronage and clandestine support allowed Elizabeth to project power abroad while preserving the veneer of neutral diplomacy. Yet the spectre of assassination by zealous Catholic extremists loomed over her court. The gunpowder plot had not yet occurred, but the seeds of fanaticism were already sown in secret chapels and hidden cells. Thankfully, Elizabeth's intelligence network, managed by her trusted spymaster, intercepted coded letters before they crossed the Channel. Agents in Rome and Madrid reported on the activities of priests and emissaries who plotted to abduct or kill her. Every suspicious courier was shadowed, every covert meeting foiled. In the quiet hours of night, letters bearing the names of conspirators were laid before the Queen, who read them by lamp until her eyes grew heavy. Her system of informants, though unseen by the populace, became the invisible shield that guarded her person and preserved the realm's stability. All the while, Elizabeth endured the aches of gout and the stiffness of advancing years. On mornings when her joints protested each step, she nonetheless summoned her council and presided over its meetings with unwavering focus. From the first light of dawn until late into the night, she received petitions, heard reports of harvest shortfalls in the countryside, and debated the merits of proposed infrastructure repairs to royal roads and bridges. Physicians tended her with poultices of comfrey and preparations of willow bark, yet she refused to relinquish her seat at the high table of governance. Her countenance, though marked by faint lines of age, retained a regal poise that commanded respect. In these final chapters of her rule, Elizabeth I became known not merely as the Queen of genteel beauty and magnetic charm, but as an austere and resolute ruler. She demonstrated that the truest measure of sovereignty lies in the steady exercise of law and duty, not in extravagant display or martial triumph alone. By fortifying local government, refining taxation, rooting out corruption, and deftly navigating the treacherous currents of European politics, she ensured that her kingdom would endure long after her passing. Even in the quiet hush of candlelit council chambers, where her voice might drift into a sleepy cadence, her decisions resonated, with lasting authority, proof that age and infirmity need not diminish the power of a will steadfastly devoted to the good of the realm. When Elizabeth I drew her last breath on the 23rd of March 1603, at the age of 69, she closed the final chapter of a reign that had stretched for nearly 50 years. The courts were hushed. In candlelit chambers across Whitehall, ministers paused their deliberations, the hush broken only by the distant toll of bells. Outside, London streets lay silent in the early dawn as word spread. The Virgin Queen, who had guided England through storms of politics and war, had passed into history. In the decades since her accession, the foundations of the English monarchy had been laid with remarkable solidity. Borders long threatened by skirmishes and shifting alliances now held firm. Treaties with France, Scotland, and the Low Countries defined realms where once marauders roamed with impunity. The fierce tug-of-war between Catholic and Protestant had quieted into a managed accord, one that balanced the rights of private worship with the unity of state. Meanwhile, the administrative machinery she had reformed continued its regulated course. Local magistrates applied uniform statutes, tax revenues filled the royal treasury, and customs officers dutifully recorded every cask of wine and bolt of cloth. The exchequer, once vulnerable to mismanagement, now brimmed with income from the expanding trade routes she fostered. England's fleets, once few in number and liable to be scattered by a single gale, had grown into a navy of stout ships and swift galleons ready to defend the realm. The ship-lightning vessels, armed with cannons and manned by seasoned seafarers, patrolled home waters and distant coasts alike. Privateers still flew under royal letters of marque, bringing back both wealth and intelligence from the Spanish Main. The docks of Plymouth and Bristol thrummed with activity. Shipwrights honed their crafts, and mariners sharpened their skills, ensuring that the fleets Elizabeth championed would endure beyond her lifetime. As the sun rose on the 24th of March, her cousin James, King of Scotland, was proclaimed sovereign as James I of England, uniting the crowns without the bloodshed that so often marked transitions of power. The succession had been arranged in careful confidentiality, well before Elizabeth's final illness. By the time James received the crown, he did so amid an atmosphere of calm continuity rather than upheaval. The Stuart era began not with revolt, but with the quiet assurance that the monarchy's authority would remain unbroken. Courtiers exchanged whispered congratulations, and ambassadors in London penned dispatches to their courts, marvelling that the realm had passed so seamlessly from Tudor to Stuart hands. In the years that followed, the legend of Elizabeth grew in vivid colour. Painters captured her likeness for posterity. She sits, a vision of ornate finery, in gowns embroidered by royal needlewomen, pearls strung about her neck like drops of moonlight, a fan of ostrich feathers held aloft in one hand. Poets and historians, striving to encapsulate her spirit, coined epithets that would endure. The Virgin Queen, a symbol of autonomy and personal agency, even as her realm proclaimed her the supreme governor of the Church of England. Her image, framed in ovals of dark wood and gold leaf, gazed out from palace halls and private manors alike, reminding subjects that she alone had commanded such loyalty, such adoration. Scholars in the centuries to come would look back and identify Elizabeth as the sovereign who knotted together the disparate threads of England, north and south, court and countryside, commerce and culture, into a tapestry of unity. They would praise her legal reforms as the bedrock of modern British governance, acknowledge her endorsement of literature and drama as the spark for an English artistic tradition that hands its lantern down to the present day, and salute her maritime vision as the seed that blossomed into a global empire. Playwrights of the Restoration and novelists of the Enlightenment adapted her story. Painters of the Romantic Age portrayed her in tempestuous seas and candlelit courts. Filmmakers centuries later would reenact her speeches and her loves on celluloid, every frame a testament to her undimmed magnetism. Nearly 5 centuries have passed, and yet the name Elizabeth I still resonates across history. She remains not only an exemplar of shrewd statecraft and personal resilience, but also a touchstone for the enduring power of intellect and vision. In the quiet corners of libraries, her portraits keep silent vigil. In the halls of learning, her policies set precedents still cited in modern law. On stages and screens around the world, her story continues to captivate audiences who sense, in her steady gaze, the whisper of a ruler who once stood at the helm of a nation, guiding it with deliberate calm through storms of uncertainty. Sleep on, Elizabeth, for your realm endures, and your legacy sails on every breeze that finds its way to England's shore. In the closing years of her reign, Elizabeth I turned her steady gaze toward the very framework of governance, determined that England's strength would rest not only on sword and sail, but also on the integrity of its laws. To this end, she championed reforms that would shape the kingdom's legal system for centuries to come. First among these was the reinforcement of the royal court, known as the Star Chamber. Once a modest council hall, it was transformed under her direction into a tribunal dedicated to rooting out corruption among high-ranking officials and noblemen. Through the Star Chamber, Elizabeth ensured that even those accustomed to wielding power unchecked could be summoned to answer accusations of bribery, embezzlement, or abuse of office. Proceedings there were conducted with gravity and discretion, often behind closed doors, so that justice might proceed without fanfare or undue influence. Elizabeth further cemented the principle of the rule of law by delivering her annual speech to Parliament in a manner both solemn and instructive. Rather than allow the monarch's voice to be drowned out by the clamour of courtiers, she insisted on addressing both the House of Lords and the House of Commons directly. In these speeches, she affirmed that no subject, regardless of station, stood above the law, and she praised Parliament's role in crafting legislation, approving taxes, and overseeing the royal budget. Each year, her words were printed and circulated in quiet copies, so that jurists and gentlemen across the realm could study her guidance. In doing so, Elizabeth established the practice of regular royal communication with the legislative body, reinforcing the balance between the sovereign's prerogative and the representative's duty, a delicate equilibrium that paved the way for the modern British parliamentary system. Recognizing that discord over matters of faith had torn so many European states apart, Elizabeth moved with cautious wisdom to set religious policy on a stable footing. She oversaw the passage of the Act of Uniformity, which mandated a common form of worship within the Church of England. The carefully calibrated rites bore a resemblance to traditional Catholic ceremonies, incense, vestments, and some familiar liturgical gestures. Yet the underlying theology hewed closely to Protestant principles of Scripture and grace. Alongside this, the religious settlement granted a measure of tolerance for private Catholic practice, provided such worship occurred discreetly and without challenge to Elizabeth's authority as supreme governor of the Church. These twin statutes, often referred to collectively as the religious settlement, established a broad middle way via media that allowed the English people to worship in peace, avoiding the bloody religious wars that raged on the continent. To support these pivotal changes, Elizabeth invested in legal scholarship and the training of judges and lawyers. Inns of Court in London, already venerable centres of legal learning, received regal patronage, enabling students and barristers to study under esteemed masters of English common law. Her charter encouraged the compilation of legal precedents into organised reports, transforming scattered rulings into a coherent body of case law that could be cited in courts nationwide. In county courts and assizes, magistrates employed standardised manuals derived from these teachings, ensuring that justice was dispensed more uniformly than ever before. These reforms bore fruit in multiple ways. Social order stabilised as subjects grew confident that disputes whether over land, contract or succession would be resolved fairly. Investors, mindful of clear property rights and reliable enforcement, felt secure in funding ventures, from expanding woolen mills in the west to outfitting ships in the southeast. Local magistrates, aware that the Star Chamber might summon them for abuses, felt increased pressure to perform their duties honestly. And religious tensions eased, as families of differing traditions found themselves bound by the same outward practices, while permitted inward beliefs without fear of reprisal. Elizabeth's legal legacy stood as a testament to her far-sighted governance. She had not only defended her realm with fleets and armies, nor enriched its culture through patronage of the arts, but had also fortified its very backbone, the rule of law. In candlelit libraries and marble courtrooms, her statutes and speeches continued to guide magistrates and legislators alike. Centuries later, historians would point to the legal innovations of her reign as crucial steps toward a stable, rights-respecting society. Even now, in sleepy halls of justice where judges don robes before dawn, one can sense the echo of Elizabeth's whispered decree that the mightiest subject was subject still to the law, and that a just realm must rest upon the unshakable foundation of fair, consistent governance. Elizabeth I possessed a vision that stretched beyond the immediate horizon, recognizing that the true measure of her reign would be how well it prepared England for generations yet to come. She understood that power built on fleeting victories or transitory alliances would crumble when tested by time. Thus, from the earliest days of her sovereignty, she wove a tapestry of selective partnerships across the courts of Europe, cultivating friendships that could be called upon in moments of need and dispensed with when no longer advantageous. In the opening years of her rule, Elizabeth maintained a discreet but steady dialogue with France, Spain, the United Provinces, and Scotland. She dispatched envoys who, under the guise of courtly goodwill, served as roving observers, men charged not only with delivering gifts of fine cloth and gold coin, but also with taking meticulous note of each realm's military readiness, its treasury's solvency, and the shifting loyalties of its noble houses. Reports returned concealed in leather pouches and coded missives, revealing the number of troops under arms, the caliber of fortress cannon, or the intrigues simmering in shadowed salons. Armed with this intelligence, Elizabeth could calibrate her own foreign policy with the precision of a master strategist, deciding when to offer tacit support to the Dutch revolt, when to temper her aid to the Huguenots in France, and when to extend diplomatic overtures to James, the King of Scots, ensuring a smooth succession when her own line would end. Within her own court, Elizabeth sought out minds as disciplined as they were brilliant. She appointed Francis Bacon to the lofty office of Lord Chancellor, charging him with nurturing the study of natural philosophy and encouraging the empirical methods that would, in future centuries, animate the scientific revolution. Bacon's essays and dialogues, penned later in his career, would reflect the Queen's own belief in the power of observation and reason. Alongside him, William Cecil, later ennobled as the First Lord Salisbury, served as Secretary of State, his counsel trusted above all others. Salisbury's penetrating analyses of domestic unrest and foreign policy manoeuvres guided Elizabeth's hand at every turn. Together, they formed the nucleus of a governance network that prized overlapping responsibilities and constant review. If one official misstepped or succumbed to temptation, another was poised to catch the error before it could metastasize into a greater calamity. On the home front, Elizabeth recognized that a nation's wealth was as much a product of its industries as of its plundered galleons. She championed the growth of English crafts, fine clothiers in the West, wool weavers in East Anglia, apothecaries distilling exotic spices in London, and encouraged merchants to seek new markets abroad. In 1580, she granted a royal charter to the East India Company, empowering English traders to sail to the coasts of India and beyond. Though its initial voyages yielded more lessons than profits, the company's foundation marked the beginning of commercial ties that would one day pour tea, textiles, and precious stones into English ports. Elizabeth's subtle support, whether through protective letters, favourable tariffs, or ceremonial endorsements, signalled to enterprising merchants that her realm would back their ventures, even across oceans they had only glimpsed on hastily sketched maps. Realising that the seas themselves would be the arteries of future power, Elizabeth established instructional academies for the Navy. At these naval academies, young gentlemen of gentle birth and hardy lads of maritime families learned navigation by the stars, gunnery drills on scaled models, and the art of seamanship in shallow draught vessels. They studied the mathematics of latitude and longitude, practiced the erecting of sails in simulated storms, and drilled in boarding tactics under officers trained in European battle tactics. By institutionalizing naval education, Elizabeth ensured that England would not rely solely on veteran captains, but would cultivate a steady supply of skilled officers and sailors. These academies, though humble at first, would eventually evolve into flagship institutions whose graduates took the lead in mapping the Pacific, establishing colonies in North America, and fending off rival fleets in the Indian Ocean. Together, these deliberate policies, shrewd diplomacy, meritocratic appointments, commercial encouragement, and naval instruction propelled England from a middling European kingdom into the vanguard of maritime powers. Where once the Spanish and Portuguese fleets had ruled unchallenged, now English vessels patrolled and challenged, sowing the seeds of an empire that would span the globe in the centuries following Elizabeth's death. It was not the work of a single campaign or a lone treaty, but of sustained, slowly turning wheels of strategy and statecraft that charted a course for unprecedented expansion. In the hush of her private chambers, Elizabeth would pore over the latest dispatches from ambassadors in Madrid or Leiden, her expression calm yet alert. She knew that the future of her realm depended less on dramatic gestures than on these deliberate, patient measures laid brick by brick. And when her reign drew to a close, the institutions she had strengthened, legal, administrative, commercial, and naval, continued their silent work, guiding England ever onward toward its destiny as a global seafaring empire. In that gentle, measured unfolding, Elizabeth I bequeathed not only a throne, but a foundation upon which her successors would build, carrying her vision across oceans and into the annals of history. One of the lesser-told but critically important facets of Elizabeth I's reign was her establishment of a comprehensive domestic intelligence and security apparatus. Recognizing that open warfare and diplomacy alone could not safeguard her kingdom against clandestine threats, she empowered her principal secretary, Sir Francis Walsingham, to organize what might be called England's first true state intelligence service. Walsingham, already known for his sharp mind and unflinching loyalty, became both Secretary of State and, informally, the nation's master of spies. Under Walsingham's guidance, a network of covert operatives spread from the courts of Europe to hidden Catholic enclaves within England. These agents, cloaked in the guise of merchants, clerics, and envoys, served as ears and eyes for the crown. They intercepted letters in ornate ciphers, observed secret gatherings in private chapels, and cultivated informants among the cells of disaffected priests and exiled nobles. In a realm rife with whispers of assassination, this silent grid of communication proved more potent than any fortress wall. As rumours of plots to kill the Queen or to hand her over to foreign powers reached Whitehall, Walsingham's men moved swiftly. They opened coded dispatches, painstakingly reconstructing each missive's hidden meaning. They even imported the latest techniques in secret writing, from specialized inks that appeared only under certain lights, to invisible watermarks only to reverse engineer them for countermeasures. In this way, England gained the upper hand in the shadow war of secrets, discovering treachery before it could be enacted. Perhaps the most famous triumph of this system came with the unravelling of the so-called Babington plot. In the year 1586, Anthony Babington, a young Catholic zealot, conspired to assassinate the Queen and place Mary, Queen of Scots, on the English throne. Unbeknownst to Babington, his letters to Mary were intercepted, read, and resealed by Walsingham's codebreakers. As each clandestine correspondence crossed the Channel, it furnished the Queen's Council with undeniable evidence of the Scots Queen's complicity. When the time came to act, Mary's fate was sealed. In 1587, she was tried and executed for treason, her death delivering a clear message to every court in Europe. Elizabeth would brook no plots, whether fomented by foreign princes or by her own subjects. This ruthless efficiency did more than neutralize an imminent threat. It elevated England to the forefront of modern intelligence gathering. While other nations relied largely on spies sent by noble houses, Elizabeth's service reported directly to the Crown, integrating foreign intrigue with domestic security in a way unseen before. Walsingham's operatives infiltrated embassies, seduced couriers, and even turned would-be assassins into unwitting informants. Their reports, painstakingly compiled into bound volumes, formed the backbone of royal decision-making, guiding Elizabeth's foreign policy with a clarity that outmatched her rivals. At the same time, the existence of such a covert network bolstered England's diplomatic posture. When envoys from France, Spain, or the Papal States arrived in London, they sensed that their own communications were under scrutiny, prompting them to tread more carefully. Those who might have plotted in the belief of safe harbour now found themselves exposed. The very reputation of Elizabeth's intelligence service became a deterrent, discouraging would-be conspirators and lending weight to her negotiations abroad. Allies knew that to betray her trust would be to invite exposure. Adversaries feared that every whisper could be traced back to the throne. Despite the moral ambiguities of spying and subterfuge, Elizabeth understood that in an age of religious fanaticism and dynastic murder plots, passive defences would not suffice. She endorsed Walsingham's methods, supplying him with funds drawn from secret exchequer accounts, and granting him the latitude to operate beyond ordinary legal restrictions. His agents were given letters patent empowering them to break open postal crates, to search private estates, and to detain suspects for questioning, all in the name of national security. These extraordinary powers, though controversial, remained unchecked as long as Walsingham's triumphs, broken plots, captured traitors, and the preservation of the realm continued to justify them. In the hushed corridors of Whitehall, long after the courtiers had retired, the Queen and her spymaster would pore over the latest dispatches. By candlelight, they traced lines of intrigue from Rome to Madrid, from Paris to the Scottish border. Elizabeth's own handwriting appears on some of these papers, her calm script directing the next move. An envoy recalled, a suspect arrested, a coded cipher changed. Though her frame aged and her joints ached, her mind remained ever vigilant, her trust in Walsingham absolute. Through this silent war of secrets, Elizabeth safeguarded her throne and her people. She sent a clear, unspoken warning that no fortress was impregnable to careful observation, and that no conspiracy could flourish unchecked. In doing so, she not only neutralized immediate dangers, but also established a model of state intelligence that would echo through the ages. The network Walsingham fashioned under her mandate became the bedrock of English security services, not simply a footnote in her reign, but a lasting testament to her strategic foresight and unyielding resolve. In her private moments, Elizabeth I cultivated an image both accessible and awe-inspiring, a monarch who seemed as at ease in the great outdoors as she did on the throne. Though she chose never to marry, she devoted many hours to pastimes that grounded her in the rhythms of country life. At dawn, she often rode out beyond Whitehall's walls, astride a well-bred destrier, her riding habit tailored to allow ease of movement, even as it spoke of regal dignity. The steady clip-clop of hooves on the dew-damp grass must have offered her a quiet reprieve from the demands of state. Hunting was another of her passions. In nearby royal parks, she pursued deer with a bow of fine yew, her skill at the longbow noted with admiration by her courtiers. On crisp autumn mornings, she could be seen drawing the string back with calm concentration, releasing an arrow that flew straight and true. These outdoor excursions, though noble in appearance, also served a more practical purpose. They tested the Queen's vitality and demonstrated that she could match any man in physical prowess. Inside the palace at Whitehall, the atmosphere often turned more intimate and cultured. Gentle strains of harp and virginal music filled the corridors, for Elizabeth loved to host private concerts in her cabinet. Musicians from across England and beyond were summoned to perform, while the Queen listened with closed eyes, fingers tapping in time or occasionally lifting to trace a muted chord. On such evenings, the royal household fell silent in deference to her presence, and only the soft echoes of strings and keys drifted through candlelit chambers. Elizabeth also used portraiture as a tool of both art and statecraft. She commissioned and gifted numerous paintings to ambassadors, nobles, and loyal servants, ensuring that her likeness and the messages it carried reached every foreign court. Among the most famous was the Armada portrait, in which she stands before a dramatic seascape, her hand extended toward the sunken hulk of a Spanish galleon. This image, rife with symbolism, celebrated England's triumph over the Armada and projected the Queen as a guarantor of national security. Recipients of such portraits were reminded that to honour her was to honour the realm itself. Though Elizabeth maintained a discreet public persona, she did not shy from display when it suited her purpose. She personally oversaw the design of many of her gowns, selecting fabrics of the finest silk and velvet, then embellishing them with pearls, ostrich feathers, and delicate lace. Each outfit was a study in colour and texture, a gown of ivory satin trimmed with copper-hued embroidery, or a robe of deep crimson velvet dotted with pearls like drops of dew. Her jewellery necklaces of perfectly matched pearls, rings set with aquamarine reflected both her wealth and her refined taste. Even as she aged and felt the twinges of gout and stiffened joints, Elizabeth adhered to a strict regimen to preserve her appearance. She favoured a diet rich in lean meats, fresh fruits, and fragrant herbs, eschewing heavy sauces that might aggravate her condition. Apothecaries prepared lotions and powders from rose petals, lavender, and chamomile, which she applied to her skin to maintain its smoothness. Though her hair was powdered white in keeping with court fashion, her cheeks retained a subtle flush, and her eyes sparkled with undimmed intelligence. To her subjects, she became affectionately known as Mother of the Nation. She understood the anxieties that gripped families left vulnerable by war or poverty. When soldiers fell in battle, Elizabeth granted pensions or small parcels of land to their widows, ensuring that households did not descend into destitution. She authorized royal physicians to treat the sick among the poor at court expense, and provided alms to struggling artisans when market downturns left them idle. On feast days, charity rolls listed the names of the elderly and infirm who received food and coin. These acts of mercy were not mere gestures. They forged a bond of loyalty between the Queen and her people. In taverns and marketplaces, common folk spoke of her kindness, repeating tales of their own brushes with royal favour. "She is like a gentle mother," they would say, "who sits in judgment yet reaches out a protective hand." This affection, cultivated through deeds small and large, underpinned the social fabric of the realm, knitting together classes that might otherwise have drifted apart. Thus, in her personal life, Elizabeth I balanced intimacy with majesty. She rode and hunted like a noble sportswoman, yet also curated the arts within her own palace. She projected power through portraits, yet designed her own attire with a woman's eye for beauty. Even as age claimed some of her strength, she remained vigilant in her care for both body and reputation. And in extending compassion to the widowed, the ill, and the destitute, she wove her own legacy into the hearts of her people, ensuring that her memory would endure not only as a ruler of unparalleled skill, but as a sovereign whose grace and generosity defined an era. When Queen Elizabeth I breathed her last on the 24th of March 1603, the Tudor era came to its quiet close, amid a hush of reverent respect. Though she left no formal will naming her successor, she had already, in measured private council, signalled that her cousin James, King of Scots, her own first cousin twice removed, whom she affectionately called "my cousin," though he once addressed her simply as aunt, would inherit the English crown. In doing so, she set the precedent for what would become known as the Union of the Crowns, uniting England and Scotland under a single monarch without the violence or civil strife that often marred such transitions. When James I ascended the English throne, he did so not with the crack of musket fire or the muster of rival factions, but with a courtly procession that wended through corridors still heavy with the memory of his aunt. The smooth succession stood as testament to Elizabeth's careful statesmanship. By keeping the question of her own mortality discreet, and by fostering cordial relations with James before her death, she ensured that no power vacuum emerged. Crowns and sceptres were passed from Tudor to Stuart hands beneath vaulted ceilings, while lords and ladies, in mourning black trimmed with silver, knelt to swear allegiance to their new king. Elizabeth's legacy endured far beyond the settled politics of succession. The legal reforms she had enacted, strengthening the Star Chamber, regularising parliamentary procedure, and codifying the annual speech to Parliament, continued to guide the kingdom's legislators and judges. Her insistence on the rule of law had laid the bedrock for a system of governance that prized debate, accountability, and the consent of the governed in matters of taxation and policy. In the decades that followed, successive parliaments would invoke her statutes as precedents, referencing the words of our late sovereign, as if her voice still resonated within the chamber walls. Culturally, Elizabeth's reign had ushered in an age of creative flourishing, whose echoes remained unmistakable. The plays of William Shakespeare, first penned and performed before her court, continued to fill London's playhouses, drawing crowds who marvelled at stories of tragedy, comedy, and history. The sonnets and epic poems of Edmund Spenser, penned under her patronage, found new readers in every county of England. Music, composed by her court musicians, innovators of madrigal and lute song, lingered in the air of noble drawing rooms. Even as James's court took shape, courtiers carried into new salons the tastes and styles Elizabeth had championed. In the realm of diplomacy and security, the networks she had built, the ambassadors she had stationed in Paris and Madrid, the spies she had dispatched in secret, remained active shields around the realm. Walsingham's successors maintained their covert vigilance, ensuring that the strategies of intelligence gathering and counterplotting established under Elizabeth would persist through the coming decades. England's reputation for cunning diplomacy had been forged in her court and would inform the policies of future monarchs, guiding a nation that now, in the early 17th century, was recognized as a power both cultured and calculating. Perhaps the most enduring symbol of Elizabeth's reign was the image of the Queen herself. In portraits she stands crowned, draped in sumptuous gowns, embellished with pearls and embroidery, her right hand holding the ivory sceptre, her left clutching a lace ruff high against her throat. Her gaze is firm, her lips set in a quiet determination that spoke of resolute will rather than youthful vanity. Artists through the ages have reinterpreted that image in paint and stone, on stage and screen, each rendering reminding viewers of a sovereign whose strength lay as much in her intellect as in her regal bearing. Nearly 5 centuries have passed since that spring morning when England knelt in mourning for its maiden queen. Yet the phrase, "Virgin Queen," still evokes her singular choice to rule unwed, preserving her authority and autonomy. The institutions she shaped, legal, military, cultural, and diplomatic, endured, evolving with the times but always bearing traces of her original design. From the maritime might that would carry English ships to distant shores, to the halls of Parliament where the balance of power between Crown and Commons would be repeatedly tested, Elizabeth's influence remained woven into the very fabric of the nation. In that final hour, as candlelight flickered over Whitehall's marble floors, Elizabeth's reign closed not with tumultuous upheaval, but with the soft, steady passage into history. Her decades of careful governance left behind not only a stabilized realm, but also a blueprint for leadership defined by wisdom, courage, and grace under pressure. The union of the crowns began a new chapter under James, but it was Elizabeth's pen that had written the final lines of the Tudor script, sending England forward as a unified lion of the seas, its roar still echoing across the waves and in the annals of time. Now, as you settle deeper into your pillow, allow the grand tapestry of Elizabeth's life to drift softly into the quiet corners of your mind. Imagine her footsteps slowing down along the corridors of Whitehall,